I never believed in haunted houses or old curses. I thought the stories were for children or gullible tourists trying to make sense of creaking floors and drafty windows. That belief ended the night I moved into the old Victorian house on Ashwood Lane. It was late October, the kind of night where the wind whips leaves across the street and every tree seems to stretch its limbs like hands toward the sky. I had just finished moving the last of the boxes into the living room. The house smelled of dust and charwood. The fireplace at the center of the room dominated the space, dark and hollow, with soot staining the bricks above it. It was cold, but I felt drawn to it, fascinated by the empty void. The first thing I noticed was the whisper. It came from the fireplace. Not a crackle of old logs, not the sound of the wind sneaking in through gaps in the walls. A faint cry, almost inaudible, so soft I thought it was the house settling. But it repeated, a low, almost human sound, like someone in pain or fear. I leaned forward and listened. The cry stopped. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was the wind or maybe a branch scraping against the chimney. I tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the sound returned. Always from the fireplace. Always faint. Always at night. I began to avoid sitting near it. I would enter the living room and sense the air heavier around the hearth. On more than one occasion, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone crouched inside the black hollow of the fireplace. But there was nothing. I tried recording the sound. My phone picked up only static. I tried placing a microphone closer to the bricks. Still nothing. And yet I could hear it. My own ears betrayed me. Or maybe they revealed what the devices could not. One evening I awoke to a loud bang. My bedroom is adjacent to the living room. The sound echoed like a log falling, only there was no fire. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and listened. That cry was there again, louder, sharper, more desperate. I could hear it clearly this time. A voice, tiny and panicked, calling from deep inside the fireplace. I tried to tell myself it was a trick. Stress from moving, fatigue, anxiety, but my body refused to accept the rational explanation. My stomach twisted. I could feel a cold sweat along my spine. That night, I could not sleep. I kept the bedroom door closed and the lights on. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every tap of a loose shutter made me flinch. The cry would come in fits, sometimes wailing for a few seconds, sometimes a single pitiful sound that made me shiver. Over the next week, the intensity increased. It was no longer occasional. The cry came at night, then in the early hours before dawn, then during the day when I was alone in the house. At first, I could rationalize it. Animals in the chimney, old pipes, the house settling. But rational thought became impossible when I noticed changes in the air around the fireplace. The temperature dropped sharply when I approached it. The soot seemed darker, almost blacker than the rest of the chimney. Shadows gathered unnaturally in the corners, curling and stretching as though alive. And sometimes, just for an instant, I could see something moving inside, a flicker of form that was not smoke or shadow. I started keeping a notebook. I documented the times, the pitch, the duration of the cries. They were irregular, sometimes short and high, sometimes long and drawn. Always human, always terrified. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, barely perceptible. Like burnt sugar mixed with something acrid and metallic. I assumed the chimney needed cleaning. I thought maybe some old debris inside had gone moldy, but the smell would flare suddenly, overpowering, just before the cry began. It would linger even after the sound stopped. I began having nightmares, not normal dreams. I would wake in cold sweat, images of people trapped inside walls, screaming silently, hands clawing the bricks from the inside. I would wake, look at the fireplace, and feel as though the faces in my dreams were pressed against the bricks, staring at me. One night, unable to bear it, I took a flashlight and peered down into the dark hollow. The light reflected off the soot and ash. I saw nothing, and yet I felt watched. A presence, just beyond perception, something waiting, breathing, desperate. I shivered, stepped back, and slammed the glass doors of the fireplace closed. By November, the house felt alive in a way I could not explain. Every night, the cries intensified. Every night, the air around the hearth thickened, pressing against my chest. I could feel it calling me, beckoning me closer, trying to pull me into the void of the fireplace. I began locking the doors, carrying knives, checking every corner. Nothing helped. The worst moment was when I saw it. I was in the living room, sitting on the couch, notebook in hand, documenting the cries again. The fireplace was dark and empty. The lights flickered, and then I saw movement. A shadow, twisting inside the hearth. A figure pressed against the bricks, impossibly thin, impossibly long, trying to emerge. And I could see the face. Pale, twisted in terror, eyes wide and pleading, lips moving silently as though forming a scream that could not escape. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. The figure disappeared. Only darkness remained. My hand shook. My heart raced. My mind screamed at me to leave, to escape, but something rooted me there, frozen by a mixture of fascination and horror. I realized then that the cry was not random. It was sentient, it was aware, and it knew I was listening. By the end of November, the cries had begun to affect me physically. Headaches, nausea, dizziness, trembling hands. I could not focus at work. I could not eat properly. I began sleeping with a pillow pressed against my ears, trying in vain to block the sound. It seeped through walls, through glass, through any barrier I tried to construct. I began speaking to it. I begged it to stop. I shouted into the empty fireplace, demanding it leave. Nothing worked. The cries intensified. The presence grew stronger. The shadows inside seemed to move independently of the light. I could feel them watching me constantly. I started researching the house. Old deeds, newspapers, anything that might explain the phenomenon. I learned that the house had been built in 1887. Previous owners had reported strange occurrences, but most had left quickly. Some claimed the house drove them mad. There were stories of a family who died in a fire decades ago, bodies never found. The fireplace had survived intact while the rest of the house burned. I began to connect the dots. The cries, the shadow, the faces in my dreams, the trapped souls. The fireplace was not merely a hearth. It was a prison. By December, I had become obsessed. I spent every waking moment documenting, observing, listening. I refused to have the fireplace cleaned, to touch it, to light a fire. I began to feel the presence extending beyond the hearth, reaching into the living room, into the hallways, into the very walls of the house. I could feel it pressing against my mind, testing, probing, waiting. One night, I awoke to silence. The house was still. The air was heavy, thick. I sensed it before I saw it. The shadow coalesced inside the fireplace. The figure pressed closer to the edge, its face pale and twisted, eyes wide and unblinking. The cry began again, low and guttural at first, then rising in pitch, echoing, piercing, a sound that vibrated through my bones. I realized then that this was not going to end peacefully. This was not something I could ignore, flee from, or escape. The fireplace was alive with the trapped, the crying, the desperate, and it was aware of me. The cry lasted for hours that night. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I could not think. Only listen. Only document. Only stare at the fireplace, terrified, knowing that the entity inside knew I was aware, knew I was afraid, and perhaps feeding on my fear itself. I do not know how long I will last in this house. I do not know if anyone will ever believe this account, but I write it because I cannot escape, because I am trapped with the cries, with the shadows, with the weight pressing from the hearth. And I fear that soon, the cry will call me into the fireplace, and I will join whatever resides inside, screaming in vain, endlessly, eternally. After the first month, the cries became more than just sounds. They became movements, presences, sensations. The air around the fireplace seemed thicker, almost viscous, pressing against my chest as if trying to make me kneel. I began to feel the floorboards creak beneath my feet, even when I was standing perfectly still, as though something heavy moved unseen beneath the house. The nights were worst. I could feel the heat of the house drop suddenly when the cry began. Sometimes it whispered first, faint at first like a voice from far away, almost drowned by my own heartbeat. Then it rose to a piercing, guttural scream, raw and human, shaking the walls, vibrating the air, leaving a hollow ache in my chest that lasted for hours afterward. I began keeping a camera pointed at the hearth, thinking that maybe recording it would capture evidence. Nothing appeared on the footage except darkness. No flicker, no shadow, no movement. Yet I could feel it there, pressing against my awareness, teasing my eyes, curling around my peripheral vision. Sometimes I would glance down at the camera in terror, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw the figure inside, pressed against the bricks, staring, pale and twisted. Then it vanished. I started hearing other things too. Footsteps when I was alone, whispers in hallways, scratching behind the walls. My mind screamed for rational explanations for pipes or rats or wind. But every rational thought was drowned by the unrelenting cry from the fireplace. It did not just sound terrified, it sounded alive, aware, desperate. I began to sense intelligence in it. It knew I was listening. It wanted me to hear. One night, I woke to a knock on the front door. I live alone. I did not answer. The knocking continued, slow, deliberate, echoing inside the house even after I pulled the door shut and locked it. The fireplace cried simultaneously, a sound that ripped through the walls and ceiling. It was as though the house itself was alive, as though the cries had the power to manipulate reality around them. I began to dream of the fireplace. In dreams, it expanded, stretching impossibly, bending the walls of the room until the hearth became a black void that swallowed everything. Figures pressed against the bricks, their faces twisted in pain and fear. They whispered my name, cried for help, begged, pleaded. Sometimes I would wake shaking, soaked in sweat, my ears still ringing with cries. By December, I could not spend a single moment near the fireplace without trembling. The shadows inside it began to move independently of light. I would see them twisting, curling, forming shapes that were vaguely human. I began to notice patterns. The cries increased in intensity when I spoke aloud, when I moved too close, when I dared to look directly into the darkness. I sought help. I called friends, neighbors, anyone who would listen. Most laughed. Some gave sympathetic smiles, dismissing it as stress. No one would stay overnight in the house. I realized then that I was alone. No one could hear what I was hearing. No one could see what I was seeing. I began to feel myself unravel, tethered only by fear and obsession. I started to document everything obsessively. I filled notebooks with times, durations, pitches of the cries. I wrote descriptions of shadows, temperatures, sensations. The more I wrote, the more I felt the presence of the fireplace intensify. It was as if my attention fed it, made it stronger, more aware. I could feel it pressing against my mind, even when I was occupied with mundane tasks. The first incident of contact occurred in mid-December. I had been sitting near the fireplace, notebook in hand, attempting to record the cries. The sound started faint, distant, and then escalated. The shadows inside the hearth twisted upward, stretching impossibly high. And then a hand emerged, not from the top, not from the sides, but seemingly from within the very bricks. Long, thin, grotesque, pale as bone. Fingers clawed at the edge of the fireplace, as though trying to escape. I screamed, stumbled backward, and the hand vanished. The room felt unbearably cold afterward, the air thick and damp. Sleep became impossible. I could not close my eyes without the cries invading my dreams. I would wake gasping, feeling as though something pressed against my chest. The fireplace seemed to watch me constantly, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every hour of terror. January brought new horrors. The cries had become intermittent, but more intense, sharper, more intelligible. They sounded less like random wails and more like deliberate communication. Sometimes I could hear individual words, fragments. Help, stop. Know me, trapped. But always twisted, distorted, impossibly slow or impossibly fast, vibrating through the floor and walls. I began noticing faces in the soot of the fireplace. Faint, fleeting impressions of eyes, mouths, noses. Sometimes they pressed outward, as if the figures were inside the bricks, trying to emerge. I would stare for minutes, frozen in horror, trying to convince myself it was my imagination, but then one of the faces would blink, or I could swear it did, and I would leap back. The temperature around the fireplace fluctuated wildly. One moment the hearth would be icy cold, the next unbearably warm, as though the cries themselves carried heat or cold, forcing my body to react in terror. I began carrying a thermometer, recording the shifts, noting the correlation with the intensity of the cries. The pattern was undeniable. As my fear increased, the temperature swung further. The faces appeared more distinctly. The cries rose to piercing crescendos. Objects in the living room began to move. Books toppled off shelves, cups slid across tables. Papers scattered into neat piles of their own accord. I would glance at the fireplace and see shadows ripple inside, bending toward the objects as though guiding them. I became convinced that the cries were not just sounds, they were commands, directives from something intelligent shaping the world around it. I started avoiding the fireplace entirely, sitting in corners of the room, reading or eating meals at a distance. Even then, I could feel it watching, pressing against the air between me and it. My dreams worsened. I would dream of being inside the fireplace, surrounded by screaming faces, trapped in darkness. The cries would echo, unending, filling every corner of the dream, vibrating through my skull until I woke, shaking, exhausted, aware that the cries continued even in waking life. One night, I saw a movement that terrified me more than the cries themselves. The soot inside the hearth shifted, swirling, forming a shape vaguely human. Eyes formed in the darkness, staring directly at me. Lips parted, and I could hear a faint whisper calling my name. The air grew thick, like swimming through syrup, and I realized with terror that the fireplace was no longer just a source of sound. It was a portal, a sentient entity aware of me, testing boundaries, probing for weakness. I attempted rituals, prayers, charms. I tried to light a fire to purify it, to drive away the presence. The moment I struck a match, the cries surged to an unbearable pitch. Flames would leap erratically, smoke curling in unnatural patterns. Shadows danced beyond the firelight, extending up walls, across ceilings, across my mind. I realized I had only made it stronger. The fireplace thrived on fear, thrived on attention, thrived on my presence. By late January, my body was deteriorating. I had lost weight, could not sleep, could not eat properly. Every moment was measured in relation to the fireplace, to the cries, to the shadows pressing outward. I felt myself unraveling mentally, emotionally, physically. The house itself seemed alive. The walls breathed, the floor moaned, and the cries never ceased, always patient, always watching, always waiting. I had learned one thing for certain. Whatever haunted the fireplace was intelligent. It was aware of me. It was aware of my fear. It could manipulate the world around it, and it was patient, immeasurably patient. And I was trapped, tethered to its presence, unable to flee, unable to resist, unable to escape the constant echo of screams from within the hearth. By February, the house was no longer mine in any meaningful sense. The fireplace had claimed the living room as its domain. Every time I entered, the air thickened, oppressive, pressing against my chest. The cries became more than sound. They were vibrations resonating through walls, through the floors, through my very body. I could feel them in my stomach, my head, my bones. Each pulse of sound a direct attack on my nervous system, leaving me exhausted and terrified. The soot in the hearth began to move independently. Shadows inside twisted and writhed, sometimes forming human shapes that pressed against the bricks, faces straining outward, eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. They shifted in impossible ways, folding over themselves, merging, separating, forming long limbs that bent at angles no human could manage. I could not look directly for more than a few seconds without my mind screaming in protest. I attempted to burn sage, light candles, even leave the fireplace unlit for days at a time. Nothing worked. Any attempt to ignore it only seemed to strengthen the presence. The cries would intensify, echoing in ways that seemed to manipulate time itself, stretching seconds into eternity, dragging hours past while I sat paralyzed in terror. Objects began moving of their own accord. Books slid across tables, chairs tipped, cups rolled into the hearth. One evening, a heavy wooden chest toppled over slowly, as if pushed by unseen hands. Shadows twisted above it, dancing against the ceiling in a grotesque choreography that made my stomach churn. I understood then that the fireplace was no longer a fireplace. It was a conduit, a sentient entity, a prison and predator simultaneously. The temperature around the hearth became erratic. I could feel freezing gusts from nowhere, followed by sudden heat that left my skin burning. The cries adapted to my presence. If I moved closer, they escalated in pitch, shattering my composure. If I tried to retreat, they followed, echoing down hallways, behind closed doors, through walls. I began to fear leaving my own bedroom, because even there, I could feel it. The presence extended beyond the fireplace, into every corner of the house. One night, I awoke to a figure emerging from the hearth. I cannot describe it fully because the human mind cannot process such aberrations. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs bending like broken branches. Its face was pale, eyes wide and unblinking, mouth moving in silent screams that I could feel rather than hear. It reached toward me, not with hands, but with the very air itself, pressing into my chest, making each breath a battle. I fell to the floor, clutching at my chest, tears streaming, knowing I could not resist. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house itself. The presence pressed closer, bending walls, stretching shadows, coiling around me in ways that made reality itself seem fluid. I realized with utter clarity that the fireplace did not merely trap the dead, it trapped the living, bending them into its own reality, consuming attention, fear, consciousness. I tried reasoning with it, begging, screaming. Nothing mattered. It was patient beyond comprehension. The cries did not merely seek to terrify. They sought to consume, to tether, to claim. And I understood finally that the house had been waiting for me, waiting for someone susceptible, someone aware enough to feed its hunger, someone trapped long enough to surrender completely. I spent weeks avoiding the hearth, tried to live on the edges of the house. But every action, every step, every thought seemed measured, known, anticipated. The cries became voices, whispering my name, calling, pleading, accusing. Shadows moved along walls even when lights were on. Faces formed in soot, twisted in agony, staring at me with recognition. I was not alone. I never had been. And the fireplace had always been aware. By March, I was a shadow of myself. My hair had thinned from stress. My hands trembled constantly. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I could not escape. The cries had become omnipresent, threading through every sound in the house. Even when I tried to leave, they seemed to follow me, faint echoes in the street outside, whispers in the night, tapping in the walls of my car. The fireplace had begun to change. The bricks twisted subtly, bending angles that should not exist. The soot thickened into blackened shapes that stretched across the hearth in writhing patterns. Figures emerged more fully now. Faces pressed against the bricks, staring directly at me. They were not static. They moved. They gestured. They whispered. And when I looked away, I felt them pressing closer, just outside perception, beyond sight, touching my mind directly. One evening, I dared to approach. I held a flashlight over the hearth and leaned forward. The shadows coalesced into a single figure. It was impossibly thin, limbs bent at unnatural angles, eyes wide and unblinking, mouth moving in silent pleas. And then it spoke, not with words, not with sound, but through my mind. Images, sensations, emotions, fear, agony, desperation. I could feel it inside me, pressing into my consciousness, feeding on every thought, every memory, every secret terror. I screamed, stumbled back, fell to the floor. The cries intensified, shaking the house, rattling windows, vibrating walls. The figures in the hearth twisted, merged, stretched impossibly high, pressing toward me. I realized finally that the fireplace did not merely house these entities. It was them, a nexus of trapped souls, of agony made flesh and shadow, of despair given sentience. I attempted escape. I packed bags. I tried to flee the house. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it, the weight of all those trapped souls pressing in. A sensation like invisible hands grabbing, pulling, twisting my limbs, my mind. The cries follow me outside, louder, insistent, commanding. I could not move fast enough. I could not resist. I returned. I had no choice. The fireplace had claimed the perimeter of my reality. Every escape attempt was met with invisible force, manipulation of time and space, distortions that made doors vanish, walls shift, hallways twist endlessly. I understood then that leaving was impossible. I was tethered to the house, tethered to the cries, tethered to the shadows pressed inside the hearth. I began to write this account because I cannot flee, because I cannot resist, because I need to document what has happened, what is happening, and what will inevitably happen next. I live in a constant state of awareness, every second measured against the hearth, every breath weighed by the cries. The fireplace has become a nexus of sentience, a predator of consciousness, a trap for the aware and the weak alike. I can see the faces more clearly now. They press against the bricks, sometimes reaching out, sometimes recoiling in terror, sometimes calling my name. I have begun to dream of myself inside the hearth, crushed among hundreds of other trapped souls, screaming endlessly, desperately, knowing that no one hears, that no one can help. I'm not sure how long I can last. The cries have begun to speak directly into my thoughts, manipulating memory, erasing details, twisting perception. I cannot trust my senses anymore. I do not know what is real. I do not know if the house has always existed like this, or if it became alive because I moved in. I only know the cries, the shadows, the faces, the weight pressing against my mind. If you ever encounter a house with a fireplace that feels too cold, that whispers when no one is there, that carries the scent of smoke mixed with iron and decay, leave. Do not investigate. Do not stare into the hearth. Do not listen to the cries. They are patient, sentient, aware. They wait for attention, for fear, for awareness. Once noticed, once acknowledged, there is no escape. I am trapped. I am aware. I am listening. And the cries continue, unending, pressing, insistent, eternal. And I know one day they will call my name from the fireplace, and I will have no choice but to answer.